Yes! Redux! Everybody, thumbs up if you finished the discussion question. Cool. Most people finished the discussion question. We're going to go over the solution, and then we're gonna use that as our jumping off point into Redux coding and see in a tiny example the simplifications that Redux allows us to make. It's gonna help us with this particular problem that we talked about yesterday, and we'll keep talking about as we get deeper in. So we've got this app class. It's got some state. It's got this count, and this is the sort of the solution here to the problem that we faced before, which was that we had this counter. We had the count displaying inside of the counter. We wanted to move the count up into the header, and so we had to move all of the logic for the count up into app. Everybody have a solution that was kind of like this? What other solutions did people come up with for this problem? Basically something like this. You have to have the state up in app if you're going to be using it in two different places. So there are a couple of things that you could have done differently. I went ahead and just moved this render description into header, but this maybe you could put into app and pass the description down into the header. Lots of different ways of sort of organizing this code. But the problem is that when we were trying to get from this place where we had all this state management in counter to the place where we have all of the state management up in app, we have to change a ton of code. So we have to change where all of this lives. That's a pretty easy cut and paste. But the other things that change, it's a lot of finicky little details about passing particular props, making sure that all of the names are right. We have to pass count into the header. We have to pass count into the counter. We have to pass these new props, increment and decrement, down into counter. Counter, instead of being able to call functions that it knows about, has to call these props. It's pretty complicated for what seems like a pretty little change. We're really only moving this one little piece of the UI from one place to another. And in order to do that, we needed 25 particularly nasty lines of code change. These are ones that are I'm sure you've seen as you've been doing your projects. These are ones it's super easy to mess up. You accidentally do this or something. You forget this and you still call it this.decrement. So let's see what happens if we accidentally leave off the dot props there. We've gotten everything else right, but our app doesn't work, it's broken, and we don't know why. This is pretty tricky. This is a pretty hard bug to figure out. So pretty dangerous. This is just a small example of the kinds of problems that we have when we're spreading our state across all of our components. When we need to refactor, when we want to move state from place to place so that we can achieve some different UI, we end up with this kind of massive set of changes for what really ought to be a small UI change. Motivated? Okay, everybody's really into this Redux idea. Don't want to do this anymore. So what we're going to do today, we're gonna introduce Redux into this single file application. We're going to get the not the real boilerplate, but some kind of boilerplate so that we can use Redux. We're going to migrate this state from component state in our app into our first Redux store. Sound good? Who made it through some of the Redux documentation last night or this morning? Who's opened the Redux documentation? Okay, if you haven't at least opened the getting started page on Redux, you should aim to try to get through most of that stuff. It is really good. It's pretty easy to follow. It's pretty well organized. There are a lot of good resources for this. in addition to actually learning Redux, this is also a good chance to sort of start to remove the training wheels that Flatiron's provided by giving you the guided tour through all of the new libraries and tools that you use to how do you figure out how to use a library from the documentation. It just so happens that Redux documentation is really, really good, and so this is a pretty easy one to learn. But for most of your career, you're going to be learning new libraries from going and reading the mediocre documentation that's available online. That's a pretty common experience. You should start now. Cool. Okay. Let's go ahead and start adding Redux to this app. In order to add Redux to this app, we'll probably need to install it. So let's go ahead, and we've got yarn in this project, so we'll yarn. How do we add a package in yarn? Yarn add. Thanks, Lane. All right. Yarn add is like npm install with --save. Yarn has got a little bit more ergonomic commands. Install does 2 different things in npm, and it's a little bit weird. Add, pretty obvious, it's going to add this package. And we can see that it actually updates our package JSON with this pinned version of this library. So now we should be able to import Redux into index.js. And the thing that we're actually going to import from Redux, we're going to import a function called createStore. We're not going to import a store. We're going to import this function, createStore. We're going to pass into that function all of the configuration we need to set up that store. It'll give us back this actual store object that we can pass around as we need to in our application. Do you guys have your whiteboards? We need to change the habits here. We need to be bringing the whiteboards into every lecture. What are the? Let's just take 15 seconds to try to remember instead of writing on the whiteboards. If you have the whiteboard, go ahead and write it out. What are the functions that we have on a Redux store? Take 10 seconds to think about it in your head. Got 2 functions. What's one of them? Oh, do we?
No,
oh, okay.
I'm big brain. That's on my voice.
We got get state, and what's the other? Dispatch. Okay. Let's go ahead, set up this store, and then we'll see how we can use dispatch and get state from this store. Has anybody from reading the docs? Has anybody seen what you need as the minimum level to configure a Redux store? No. Okay. That's cool. Gives us a sense. It gives me a sense of where we are in the docs. So far, not quite there yet. That's fine. We need to set up our store. We're gonna go ahead and just store it in a const, and we'll say this is going to be the result of calling createStore. Let's go ahead and see what happens on our site. Error, expected the reducer to be a function. So, a couple things we learned. 1, yes, we can import createStore. That's a valid import. 2, when we try to just call createStore, just like this, we get this error, expected the reducer to be a function. Kind of a confusing error. It's confusing if you don't know that createStore, it needs a reducer as its argument. We need to pass in the function that determines how this store transitions when it gets an action. Remember we had the diagram yesterday where we pass in actions to our store, and then it runs some reducer, and then it outputs the new state. If we don't have that reducer, if we don't have that, the store doesn't work. So we need to go ahead and set up a reducer. We need to have some reducer function so that we can create our store. Let's make a reducer. What's the function signature of a reducer? take 10 seconds. Think about it in your head. Function signature means like, what are the arguments and what's the return value? We're steadily getting better at actually taking the seconds to think about it. It's teamwork. It's teamwork. Okay, let's hear it.
It takes in state and action.
It takes in the old state and an action. And someone else, what is it going to return? What's the type of the return value? What's it going to get used as? The new state, right? It's going to return the new state. A lot of times you'll see people either in a comment, they'll say takes in state and action. Maybe they'll give a type for this. They'll say state is an object with key count, and action is an object with key type, which is a string, and then returns a new state, which is an object with a count. Sometimes you'll see this kind of in this type annotation. You'll see a comment that says here's what this function takes in and here's what it returns. Oftentimes this is a pretty useful way of thinking about any function. What does it take in and what does it return? Thinking in types usually helps clarify what our functions are supposed to do. If we're not passing around the correct types, if we're calling the function with the wrong values, if we're returning the wrong kind of value from our function, thinking in types often helps clarify, solve those kinds of conceptual problems. Cool. What's the state that we've got in our app? This application that we've got here. It'll take 5 seconds. This one. All right, let's see. Thumbs up if you think that you know what the shape of the state is for this application. Again, I can take us back to Chrome. Oh, we're still in the error mode. Let's go ahead and comment out our store. Thumbs up if you think you can figure out what the state is for this application. Okay, we're at about 50%. You guys remember when we were talking about thinking in React? We built out our component hierarchy, and then from our component hierarchy, we picked out what state we needed in each of our components. And we also thought about how our components were going to pass around that state to each other so that everything had access to what it needed. When we're in Redux, we actually don't need to think about the components so much. We just need to think about what state keys we want to be keeping track of. So in React, we're thinking about components and answering the question, which component owns which state? Owns which state? In Redux, all we need to decide when we're thinking about our state is what state do we need? When I'm answering this kind of question, I'm thinking about what keys and what JavaScript types those keys' values are going to be. So it's going to be some kind of object. It's going to have some keys and some values. For this application, what are we keeping track of?
Just the count.
Just the count. And what's the type of the value? Integer. Count is going to be an integer. In JavaScript, it's a number because it's all only one kind of number in JavaScript. Spooky. Okay, so we're going to write a really dumb reducer first. It's not going to pay attention to the action. It's also not going to pay attention to the old state. It's just going to return some count, and it's going to be fixed to 0. This isn't a very good reducer, but that's okay. It's a reducer. It takes in a state and an action and returns a new state. It doesn't actually work. It's not going to increase or decrease the count when we click some buttons. It doesn't respond to any actions. But the shape of it is right, so we can use it. We can start with that. Now we can actually create our store. We'll pass in the reducer. And let's just see if we can console log our store, just to see if it is getting created correctly. Okay, no more error. That's good. You can see that our store is getting logged. And as we promised yesterday, it's an object. It's got dispatch and get state. It's also got a couple of other functions: replace reducer, subscribe, symbol, observable. We're gonna mostly ignore these other functions. There's gonna be a point in lecture today where we're gonna use subscribe, but you're really never gonna have to use it on your own. So mostly ignore, other than dispatch and get state. Okay, so we got this store object, and we know that we should be able to get the state out of it and dispatch actions to it. Let's try a debugger, just so we can try messing around with this store. Let's see if our store's here. Great. Let's see what the store's state is. Huh. The store's state is count 0. This isn't super surprising because our reducer returns count 0, but we haven't actually sent any actions into the store yet. We didn't dispatch anything. So how did our reducer function get called? Does anybody have any guesses?
It was called when the store was created.
It was called when the store was created. That sounded like it wasn't a guess. Somebody's been reading the docs, or has a good idea of what the designers might have done. Let's go ahead and log the state and the action in our reducer, just so we can see what happens. Okay. Interesting. Let's actually go ahead and add some strings to this logging so that we can see what everything is. State, action. This way. Okay. We see we've got state undefined, action, type Redux init sklgcdb, something kind of gross. Yeah, okay. This is the Redux init action. It gets emitted when we create our store for the first time. So it gets passed into our reducer, and our reducer runs. The reason it's named so funny, it's like, okay, this should be readable. We need to know that it's the Redux init action. But the Redux designers don't want you to actually have a case for the init action, because they don't want you to depend on that. They'd much rather you just return some initial state. So instead of having you be able to predict this, they add a little bit of randomness. And so every time that you do it, it's going to have some bit of random letters after it. Fine. Okay. We get this init action, and the return value from our reducer ends up being the initial state of our store. So when we get state in our debugger, store.getState, we see we're at count 0. Okay, that seems pretty cool. We want to be able to update this state. How do we need to set up our reducer so that it can change over time, this count. What are the things that we need to be able to do to our state? What state do we need? That's our first question. We've decided it's got this shape. The next question we ask are, what actions does our store respond to? And based on these actions, what does it do? What happens to the values in the state? Let's try taking 10 seconds, thinking about what actions this store should respond to and what it's going to do in response. Before we try to solve that, what's an action? Somebody can go ahead and raise a hand for this one.
It's an object.
Robin says it's an object. True. Action is definitely an object. What else do we know about actions?
It has a type key.
Type key. And that's it. That's like the core of actions. Is an action allowed to have anything else other than an object with a type key? Thumbs up, you think yes. Thumbs down, you think no. Your hand, you can do hand in the middle if you're not sure. Okay, we got some thumbs up. We think we're allowed, and we got some thumbs in the middle. Not sure. Okay. We're allowed to do anything else. Anything else we want. We'll see maybe a use for that later. Okay. What are the actions that we want this reducer to respond to? What do we want to be able to do to this count? Andrew?
Increment and decrement.
Increment and decrement. Okay. Yeah. So we want to be able to make the number go up, increment, and go down. There. So this is pretty similar to the calculator example that we had from yesterday, where this reducer, it's going to have some kind of conditions. It's going to look for the type of the action, do some different thing based on the type of the action. Let's try to write our reducer, and then we'll test it out with some actions just here in the debugger. Before we can actually write out the reducer, let's go ahead and write our const increments action. It's going to be an object with a type. And what do we want to name the type here? Increment. We're going to need this to be all caps so that we're aligned with the convention. It'll work if it's lowercase, but we probably want it to be all caps. We'll go ahead and give ourselves a decrement action 2. That way when we try this out, we can just dispatch these actions into our store, and then we'll see what happens. Let's go ahead and try dispatching them now. We'll store dispatch our increment action. Cool. We see that we dispatched and we saw that the state was the old state. We got the action that came through. Pretty cool. We can dispatch it again. State was the same. So nothing's changing yet. That's okay. That's everything's behaving as we expected. We can dispatch actions to our store. They do go through our reducer. We're logging them. We're seeing the old state and the action that's coming through. So far, everything's working the way that we thought it would. Let's go ahead and actually respond to this action. If the action type is increments, what do we want to do? Yeah, we'll return some object. It should have counts. How are we actually going to increment the count from the old count?
Call state. You give like the count state.
Right. We have the old count in this state object. So we can call state.count plus 1. Okay. Else if let's actually stick to that for now. We'll just look at the increment action. We should see that this gives us state.count plus 1. Okay. Let's try it. Right now, if we call store.getState, count 0. Store.dispatch the increment action. It got in count 0. We see that the action was this object with type increment. And then when we call store.getState, count is 1. Nice. Okay. Cool. Cool, cool. The plumbing is working. We can flush the toilet. Pretty good. Let's go ahead and add our handler for the decrement action. Else if action.type equals decrements. Let's handle this case. What's this line going to be?
Similar to what we had for increment, except instead of adding 1, it's going to be subtracting 1.
Cool. Okay. We're going to do basically the same thing. We just want to have the decrement minus 1. We're creating a new object here. We're not mutating the state. We're not doing state.count plus equals. This is pretty important. We're not changing the old state. We're returning a new state object. Okay. Let's go ahead and see that we can do this. Store.getState, dispatch an increment action. Store.getState, dispatch an increment action. GetState, dispatch a fancy new decrement action. GetState, count goes back down. What if we keep decrementing? Cool, it can go below 0. Seems like it's pretty much working. What if we store.dispatch an action with type reset? Is this going to work? No, we haven't set up the handler for a reset action. So when we start, wait a second.
Oh my God.
That's pretty weird. Does Redux have some kind of special handling for reset? That seems strange. Let's dispatch an increment action. Let's dispatch start over. Okay, so maybe Redux has special handling for a bunch of weird actions. That seems unlikely. Let's actually take a look. I'm guessing that we've written a bug. Okay, so our reducer gets called every time we dispatch an action, even if we don't have any handlers for it. So if we see that we're not the increment action and we're not the decrement action, we go all the way down back to this line 20. So when we saw that reset action come through, we had state count minus 2, action type reset. So we made it through these ifs and elses. We hit this, and we reset the count to 0. This is pretty important. We actually have to think about this fall through case because our reducer is going to see every single action that comes through the store. So if there's an action that's got a typo, or it's misnamed, or it's just something that this reducer doesn't care about, we want to make sure that it doesn't respond in a way that's broken. This is like a pretty common way to break your state. Okay, how do we actually want to fix this? Return state. Okay, so if it's not an action that we care about, we can just return whatever the old state was. Let's try it. Let's refresh. See in our console, store.getState. That's not good. Store.dispatch. Oh gosh. Oh man, everything's broken. Why is it Why did this not work? We were using that line. This line was handling the init action. This was our initial state. Okay, if the state comes in as undefined, if state triple equals undefined, then we want to return count 0. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and return state. Does that make sense? Should that work? Let's see it. Save, refresh. Should count 0 action, didn't get an error. Get state, count 1, great, back in business. This is kind of gross. It's kind of a gross check to have to do. JavaScript actually provides a nice way to set a default value for a function. Does anybody remember the syntax for that? Yeah, in the argument line, how do we actually do it? Right, state equals the default value that we want to set it to. Okay, it's doing the same kind of check. It's checking if state was undefined and saying, hey, if state's undefined, go ahead and set it to count 0. If it's defined, if you passed in an argument here, don't set it to count 0. This is just a default argument. This is a common way to set the initial state in a Redux reducer. This is a pattern you'll see. Okay. Let's see. State. Ooh, this time instead of seeing undefined, we saw the initial state when we logged. Neat. Get state, count, dispatch, count 1. Okay, cool. It seems like our reducer is basically working. We've got the shape of our state. We've got the actions that our store responds to, the increment and decrement actions. We need to actually use this store in React. Let's go ahead and use this store in React. What this means is we're going to delete all of the places that we were using state in the rest of the app. Instead of doing anything that uses state, we're just going to go ahead and delete this. Just delete it all. Let's leave these props. How do we actually get the count out? Wow. Okay, I'm a little too aggressive on my deleting. How do we get the count out of our store? Okay, we're going to store.getState. What do we get from store.getState? We get the state of the store. Yes, we're going to get the whole object. So if we want to just get the count, and that's what we want to pass as a prop, dot count. Okay. We're not going to use setState anymore. So let's go ahead and get rid of these lines too. What should this increment line be? Dispatch? Okay. Store.dispatch. What should it dispatch? Our nice increment action. And I'm going to do the same thing in decrement, but with the decrement action. This seems pretty good. Any other changes we need to make here? Uses of state that we have forgotten about? Looks good to me, but maybe it's broken. Header count. Cannot read property count of null. Yes, this.state.count in the header. Okay, so this refactor, also takes some effort. It's not free changing your state to use Redux, but now things, okay. This.
It's working great. I love it.
It's beautiful. Our count is going up and down. but it's not re-rendering. Something is still broken. We can see our store change. We see it logging. It's getting all of our actions. So the dispatch is working, and the state is actually changing. Okay, pop quiz. What triggers a re-render in React? Okay, set state. What are the other things? Okay, we've got set state. What else?
That's what set state is doing, a change in state.
Okay, so a change in state.
Or a change in props.
Change in state or a change in props. Change in state or a change in props. What else?
Page reload.
Page reload. Interestingly, yeah, I think that we get a mount action when we first mount, like initial mount. That's like our first render.
There's some force, there's some like direct command.
Yeah, there's something else. We can force an update. Anything else? Okay, this is it. We get our initial render, we get changes to state, we get changes to props. We also have this force update, which forces an update. If you remember, if you go back to that React lifecycle diagram, you can go ahead and see that these are the only things that are going to trigger a render. Are any of these things changing?
No.
No. If none of these things change, we don't re-render. So despite the store changing, none of these are changing. And so we need some way to tell React to re-render our components now that our Redux store state has changed. We're going to first do this in a hacky, gross way, and then we're gonna come back and fix it with some much nicer way.
Thank you for prefacing that before I take a bunch of notes on the hacky gross way.
No, don't never do this. Okay, we're going to do this with a response to component did mount. When component mounts, this is also where we're going to use that store subscribe method, which you also probably won't use for the most part. Store subscribe takes a callback function. When we get some kind of update to the store, it'll call the callback function on all of the subscriptions. So subscribe, pass in a callback function. It's going to call that callback function every time that we dispatch a new action to the store. Don't actually have to remember that. That's why we're moving pretty fast. Okay. Wow. Pretty cool. Now, we're force updating. We're changing our store. We're force updating every time we get a change to the store, and so we re-render. This has a lot of problems. One, it's kind of a gross subscription. Two, we're using force update. Three, the whole app is re-rendering every single time we change anything in the Redux store. So this is probably not the solution that we want. It's not very expressive. It's pretty gross. So let's actually go ahead and list out the problems that we currently have in Redux. We've got this gross subscription. What are our other issues right now with Redux or with this app? This is not a great app, guys.
It's all on
Pretty nice thing.
It's all in one page. Not modular. It's all in one page. So we have to find some solution for making it so that we can use Redux in a modular fashion. Let's just go ahead and note the parts of this subscription that are gross. It's one, we have to set it up. 2, it like re-renders our whole app every time. Like re-renders all components on any store change. Yeah, so not very expressive either. It doesn't tell us anything about our components or what has changed that's triggering these re-renders. Anything else that we don't like about what we've got set up so far?
Else if.
Yeah, this if else if business, that's not awesome. If else if, particularly if we get pretty like complicated, if we've got lots and lots of actions, this could get kind of gross. What can we do to fix this if else if business? We can take this right now.
Switch.
We can use switch. Okay. Let's go ahead and do this. Switch has got one like gotcha, and so we should see the gotcha. Switch syntax looks like this. We switch on some value, and then we've got a bunch of cases. Case increment. We want to do this. Case decrement. We want to do this. And returning state, this is kind of our default case. And this is actually the syntax for a default case. You just say default. One of the things that's kind of tricky about switch statements, if you don't return here, it doesn't only do this case. So let's actually see what happens if we do this the wrong way. We'll say let new state equal state because we're copying over all of the old values. And then we're going to, after our switch, we're going to return our new state. And instead of returning these things, we'll say new state equals and in the default case, we actually don't need to do anything. Okay. This is going to be pretty wacky. What? Why? Why? Take a second to trace through this code. This is saying take all of the keys and values from the old state, copy them into this new object called new state. We're switching on the actions type. We're getting the increment action. And so we're setting new state equal to this new object. And then because we don't have a break or a return here, we fall through and do the decrement case too. So we set new state equal to this object, and then we're returning new state. This is a pretty wacky bug. My response is to just like always return from these cases, particularly in a reducer. That'll basically handle this 100% of the time. If you find yourself using a case statement in some other situation and you don't want that behavior, you can also use a break. Let's actually see the break for this, just to see that it works. Break. Okay. And okay, now we fixed adding and subtracting. Hooray. Okay, let's actually I'll just undo my way back to a good world. Okay. And looks like we're fixed. Cool. Okay. Fixed with a switch statement. Good call. Fixed with switch. What else is either bad right now or could get bad if our app got big?
State and reducer. The default. Like, right now we only have count.
Right now we only have count. what would happen if we had lots and lots of keys? How many keys about did you have in your React applications for Mod 4? Just like hold them up on your hands if you can. If you had more than 10, just go. It was a lot of state keys. Trying to handle all of the different actions in one big function would be a nightmare. Oh my gosh, we definitely need some kind of solution to figure out how to deal with many keys and many actions. How to deal with many keys and many actions. What else is wrong? Okay, I've got one. So far, we haven't actually really reduced our complexity all that much. We're still passing these props from our app to our header and our counter. So right now, we haven't really made our lives that much easier. But we can actually fix part of that problem pretty straightforwardly right now. Let's go ahead and just move the increment and decrement actions back down into our counter. Say, okay, it can increment and decrement. It doesn't need a prop. You can just increment and decrement. And then instead of this props count, it can just go ahead and get the state itself. It doesn't need to depend on the parent. Right? We actually don't need any of these props. Counter is now self-contained. That's pretty cool. This is actually really cool, because now app doesn't have to know anything about the count. All app is responsible for is showing this counter. It says, here's where the counter goes. It doesn't know anything about the state because it doesn't have to. It doesn't really need to. It doesn't make sense for the app to be responsible for that state. Why should app know anything about count? It's just showing these components. Now it still knows something about this count, but we can probably get rid of that too. Let's go ahead and say, instead of depending on this.props.count, we can say const count is store.getState.count, and then we can just use the count from the state. You can see that this is still working. Wow. Our app got pretty simple. This is pretty nice. Now, it's eventually going to lead us to have some problems when we want to make this more modular. Because right now, we just have this store constant in our app. We just have it floating around. If we've got these components in lots of files, like we probably want to, then we're not going to have this store constant declared in all of our files. We'll need some way of connecting to the store. We need some way to connect to the store that's going to scale when we have lots and lots of components. It would be cool if, when we were doing that, we also got to get rid of this subscription and express something about which pieces of the state each of these components actually needed. Because they don't need the whole state. They probably only need a little piece of it. It turns out that React Redux does give us the ability to do that kind of really nice descriptive. It's also a little bit more efficient. It's like going to be faster because we only have to update when we care, like something that we care about changes. It's pretty cool. So we're gonna get to that. starting this afternoon and then going over the next couple days. Final thing, got a little challenge. I'm gonna go ahead and slack this code out. What y'all should do for the next few minutes, try to add the buttons and actions and cases to your reducer so that we can increment and decrement by +3 and -5. So that's a new button next to either of these buttons, a -3 button, and a +5 button. Or was it -5 and +3? +3, -5. We want two new buttons, and they should make things go up and down by 3 and 5. Okay, I'm going to select this out, and y'all can go ahead and give it a try. Okay, so we have a couple more things that we found as we were solving this. It's pretty easy to make typos in the strings for our actions. Raise your hand if you ran into like an issue with a typo in an action type. An action type. Oh. Okay, I saw some of you run into this typo issue. You do not have your hands up. Okay, it is pretty easy to make typos. We'd like to have some solution that made it harder to have action typos. We also saw that it was a little tricky when we were adding more and more buttons beyond the plus and -3. We didn't have a powerful way to parameterize our actions, or we needed one. We needed one in order to make this easier to do for lots and lots of buttons. Let's first do the initial solution, the one that makes the most sense given what we've got. What is the sort of the intuitive thing to do? We want two more buttons. What do we change about this code in order to make this work?
Add 2 buttons.
Add 2 buttons. Step 1. Absolutely right. Let's go ahead and copy and paste these. Go ahead and say that we're going to have 2 more buttons, -5 and +3. And I don't need Slack anymore. I want Chrome. We refresh. See, got our new buttons. Beautiful. They're not exactly working as they indicate, but that's okay. We can fix their actions next. Let's go ahead and fix their actions. Instead of increments, which just increments by 1, what did everybody do with this button?
Increment by 5.
Increment, right, by I think this one's by 3.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and go increment by 3, and this is a function that, what does this function do, the increment by 3 function?
Store dispatch.
Store dispatch some action, but instead of this increment action, we want some new kind of action, maybe like an increment by 3 action, and then we'll need a new action here, increments by 3, something like that. Okay, does that fix it? Let's see.
So you have to
Increment by 3 action is not defined. Increment by 3 action. Okay. Well, now it's not working at all. What's the other piece that we need in order to fix this?
switch statement.
A new case in our switch statement. Okay, let's go ahead and it's going to be pretty similar to this case. So we'll copy paste. Instead of increment, we're responding to increment by 3. And instead of incrementing by 1, we increment by 3. And now clicking this +3. Nice. Not bad. Now our -5 is also broken. So let's go ahead and fix it. While we're up here, we know that we're going to have a new decrement case for decrements by 5, by 5, it's going to take the count down by 5. We'll need a new decrement action. Decrement by 5 action. It'll decrement by 5. And instead of just decrement, we want to decrement by 5. Whew, this is kind of a lot of work. We want to decrement by 5, and this is a function that store dispatches, not the decrement action, but the decrements by 5 action. Okay. Kind of a lot of changes in order to get this to work. I'm not really looking forward to adding the buttons from -10 to 10. If I have to add lots and lots of buttons, it would be pretty painful. So what other solutions do we have other than every time we want to add some new functionality, adding a new action, case in our switch statement? What else can we do here to make this a little bit more flexible?
Add a property to the action.
Add a property to the action. Yeah. This is this thing that we promised that we would come back to later, which was anything else that we need, we can dump in the action. What's the other property that we want to put in our action objects? Instead of just type, what else do we want? Some kind of amount. I like that a lot. Okay, so instead of just type increments, we'll have amount 1 or amount 3 or amount 5 or whatever amount. That'll be a pretty good action, and we should be able to use that. Let's go ahead and change this piece by piece. Let's first leave these actions alone and just add in amounts. We'll say these are just increment actions that have amounts. This is just a decrement action that has an amount. When we decrement by 5, we want to dispatch the decrement by 5 action. And now we don't have any more increment by 3 action or decrement by 5 action. Now we just have increment and decrement. But we've also got the amount coming through our action. So let's actually take a look. We see that this amount is coming through in our action. And now we can change our reducer so that it, instead of just hard coding the value that we're going up or down, it depends on the amount in the action. Action dot amount minus action dot amount. Okay. That's nice. Seems simpler. We can probably make this even simpler by refactoring these functions. I'm not going to go ahead and do that for you. I think that you can probably do that on your own. But there's some cleanup that we can do to make it so that we have fewer hard-coded functions that do a particular thing. Okay. Using actions, the payload in our actions, in this case, the count as the other key in our action. This is a pretty general thing that we're going to need to use. So you'll pretty frequently see some keys in your actions as something that you're dispatching when you're sending that action out, and then something that you're relying on in your reducer function. Cool? Cool. All right. How do you parameterize actions to make them more abstract and general? This one, pretty nice answer. Add more keys to the action. And then like the corresponding behavior in the reducer, and you have to like actually set those keys when you're sending those actions out through dispatch. So corresponding handling the users. Cool. Any questions about what we've got so far? All right. Let's leave it there. This afternoon, we're going to come back and start to address some of these problems. We're going to focus on dealing with this subscription and how we might start to modularize these components, because that's like the biggest bad thing we've got right now. I think it's probably tomorrow that we'll actually start to deal with many keys and many actions. This is going to come from something that Redux provides called combine reducers. It's going to be pretty cool. Dealing with the subscription, connecting our React components, this is going to come from React Redux, which is a library that helps us connect React and Redux. So we're going to check out provider and connect. Awesome. I think that going through the Redux docs is still going to be your number one way to get through this stuff. I think we might also deploy some labs. Continue to check out that warm-up exercise if it is helpful. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.